number 1 on your PowerPoint.
Oh, I got it. Hang on. There you go. Now we're there?
Yep, you got
All
it.
right. Very good. All right. Let me get one more thing sorted. All right. So, as Kathy mentioned, my name is Amy Mays. I've been in the disability community for maybe over 20 years, and I'm also a practicing attorney. Actually started out my career working for a legal advocacy organization here in Michigan. And so cut my teeth as a baby lawyer on the Americans with Disabilities Act and haven't stopped since. As I said before, it's a complicated topic, service animals. And so we're going to start with what we're going to learn today. And in this session, I'm going to cover protected status of animals under the ADA, under Title I, as it relates to private employment, Title II, as it relates to public entities, the services and programs and activities that they provide, as well as the transportation provisions that are under Title II, and then also private businesses under Title III, that's your hotels, your restaurants, taxi services, ride shares, etc. And then I'm just going to briefly mention some other federal laws that address animals because it does kind of muddy the waters when it comes to navigating access. All right. What's in a name? If any of you do a Google alert on service animals or see any types of headlines, you're going to see any number of names: service, guide, hearing, signal, seizure alert, assistance, psychiatric service, therapy, emotional support, companion. Regardless of the name, it's really going to come down to what does the animal do? Has it been specifically trained to do a certain function or task? And so we're going to get into that in detail. I want to give you, though, before we get into any of the specific titles, I want to talk generally about service animals as they're defined under the ADA. You're going to see that there are differing definitions. There's a more broader definition and there's a narrower definition. And I'm going to talk about those two differences. But there's some also very common requirements when it comes to discerning whether it's a service animal. And those two common requirements are they must be individually trained to do work or perform a task for the benefit of the individual with a disability, and that work or task performed is directly related to the individual's disability. So it can't be, I feel good when I have my dog next to me. It has to be a specific task or function, and we'll get into that a little bit. Now, there's also, so there's certain tasks or functions that would qualify: pulling a wheelchair, retrieving dropped items, alerting a person to a sound if they are deaf or hard of hearing, reminders to take medications, pressing elevator buttons, alerting to someone to a possible seizure coming on, assistance in navigating access for someone who is blind, alert to the presence of allergens, and perhaps preventing or interrupting an individual's impulsive destructive behavior. And those are just a few samples of what you would see in terms of functions or tasks. Now, a companion or an emotional support animal is generally defined as a companion animal is defined as an animal that provides a benefit without specific training. So paired with an individual with disability who benefits from their presence. And so earlier, before many of you logged on, Susan was talking about caring for her mother's pets and how they kind of grew on her. And now looking at perhaps having one as an emotional support animal. And so that is recognized. It certainly is something that many, many people benefit from, but it may not be something that you can, or it may not be an animal that you can access the places you want to go. And we'll talk about that. And the problem is because when you're talking about a companion or an emotional support animal, if there's not an individually trained task or function, then it's really tenuous legally to understand the difference between its role as an emotional support and its role as a pet, right? Now, a therapy animal is generally defined as an animal that provides therapy in a context like a clinical setting. For instance, I have some very good friends who put their dog through training to go into nursing homes, and he would go in and he would go up to people and greet them, and he would also do different tricks, like they taught him how to pray and how to actually dance around. So just different things to help people lift up their spirits. So it's therapeutic in a clinical setting, but it didn't have any individual task or function, and it wasn't specific related to an individual's disability. Okay? All right, so now that you have those general overviews of what a service animal is versus a companion and a therapy animal, meaning service animal, specific individual task or function related to an individual's disability. Companion therapy, general in nature, I feel good when my animal is here, and or I'm going to take my dog to the nursing facility because he can provide some support emotionally to those in that setting. All right, now we're going to get into the ADA and all of its titles and what is allowable and what isn't. All right, so there are 5 titles under the ADA, and each title, except for Title 5, has an administrative agency tasked with implementing and regulating the mandates of the ADA. So just this morning, I was doing a little prep before the presentation, and I saw a headline that read, ADA defines service animal as a dog or a miniature horse. So it's not really true. The ADA, the Act itself, doesn't define what a service animal is. You have to look to each title, and then within each title, you look to the regulations. So Title I, again, deals with private employers, and Title I is regulated by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Title II, Subtitle A, which deals with public entities, programs, services, and activities of your local public service, your townships, your cities, and then Title III, your private businesses. The Department of Transportation Federal Transit Authority regulates Title II, Subtitle B, public transportation, light, rapid rails, commuter rails, bus, Amtrak, publicly funded transportation. And then Federal Communications Commission regulates Title IV. And then, as I said, Title V is miscellaneous provisions, very important provisions, but yet does not have implementing regulations. So, as you're going to see, depending on which title you're working with, there will be a different definition you'll be understanding. So employment, Title I, private employers. EEOC regulations are silent in addressing animals in its regulations. So you will not find a regulation under Title I of the EEOC that defines a service animal in one way or the other. You will find in their 1991 Technical Assistance Manual a site that provides an example of a situation where an employer would have to modify a no animal policy as a form of a reasonable accommodation in the workplace. And so with that guidance, that is what people have been able to use to advocate for access to their service animal in the workplace. Now, because it's silent as to what defines a service animal, when it comes to requesting access for your service animal in the workplace, it will be treated as a reasonable accommodation request. And therefore, is it an undue burden? Is it going to disrupt the operations of the business or operations? And those are very high standards to meet. So in many cases, a person is successful if in fact that animal is something that they need. Now here's the caveat. In looking at some case law and how it's been interpreted, even if an employee comes in and says, this is my service animal, and this dog has been individually trained, or this parrot or this ferret has been individually trained to do a specific function or task for me related to my disability. What the courts have been saying is, yes, but how does that relate to the essential functions of your job? And so many times courts have been saying, look, if you can't show me how that dog is necessary for you to perform the essential functions of your job, it's not a reasonable accommodation in the workplace. So, although it's wide open as to what perhaps someone may request in terms of a service animal, it's still under that reasonable accommodation standard. And certainly the courts have been less favorable to allowing animals in the workplace. And again, they seem to start to be looking at more of this analysis of how does that job, has that dog been trained, or that service animal been trained in your facility, in your job, to do a specific function that you wouldn't do as a result of your disability. So that's service animals in the workplace. And again, is the animal needed because of the disability? Would it cause someone to do undue hardship in terms of reasonable accommodations? There's no requirement that the animal be trained or certified, and I'll talk about that in more detail later, but there is no national or state recognized certification, training, vest wearing, acknowledgement out there for any type of animal in terms of providing a service. So you don't have those types of requirements. They can ask for documentation. Of course, that's directly in line with how you would handle reasonable accommodation request. And if in fact a request is granted, they may also have to look at providing a designated relief area for that animal if that's needed as well. All right, so in looking at some other cases, there was some discussion about an animal's presence and the effect on other employees, and ways to look at avoiding this idea of it being an undue burden because of that. And there are separate paths of travel that people can use, and teleworking, which I think right now has busted wide open in terms of an option for many, many of us. And then waiver requirements for face-to-face meetings if that would be workable. So many things have come up in the courts in terms of ways employers can handle reasonable accommodations and look at alternatives that can still provide the accommodation and yet meet the needs of the other employees. All right, so we know now that EEOC does not define
Good afternoon.
a service animal. So let's look to Title II of the ADA. And Title II has two sections. The first section, subtitle A, covers programs, services, and activities of state and local governments, all your public programs and services. And then subtitle B deals with transportation. And as I said earlier, there's two different regulations that come into play there.
Oh, I think I might have just muted you by accident. I think you had to unmute yourself. Did you unmute yourself, Amy?
Yep, I sure did. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I just heard some background, so I wanted to mute everybody else.
All right, so let me just back up here real quick just to be safe. Oh, hang on, going forward, not backwards. All right, so as I said in the previous slide, Title II has two sections. Subtitle A, which deals with programs, services, and activities of a state and local government entity. And then Subtitle 2, or B, that deals with public transportation. Now, Subtitle 2, here we go. Title 2, Subtitle A, and Title 3 of the Americans with Disabilities Act are regulated by the Department of Justice. And they do define a service animal. They define a service animal as any dog that is individually trained to do work or perform tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability, including physical, sensory, psychiatric, intellectual, or mental disability. They have also provided an exception allowing miniature dog or miniature horses. So here we have a very, very specific defined definition of what a service animal is as it relates to access to local program services and activities and to private businesses. DOJ provided some further clarification to say that tasks performed, again, must be directly related to an individual's disability. And emotional support animals or comfort animals, therapy dogs, are not service animals. Now, again, if you come in saying, this is my emotional support dog, but you've also trained it to individually do something for you, those are the types of things you need to talk about. And so to really understand, even your language matters in terms of how you're presenting this animal. But again, it has to be individually trained to do a specific function or task for that individual, and it's related to that disability. Other species of animals, whether wild or domestic, trained or untrained, are not considered service animals. And a doctor's note does not turn an animal into a service animal. So you have an emotional support animal, you had a doctor who signed off saying you need this animal. That doesn't rise to the level of being a service animal. Why? Again, because you want to look to that individually trained requirement. And personal protection, security dogs, police dogs are not protected under the ADA. So again, these are our further clarifications from the Department of Justice. Individually trained. Now they must receive some type of training, have received some type of training. And again, there are no set requirements as to the amount or the type of training. It's just that you have to individually train that animal to do something, perform a task or function. Now, animals in training, the courts have ruled, many courts have ruled that an animal must have completed its training to perform a task or function related to their individual disability. And that an animal that is still in training cannot be considered a service animal for purposes of modifications. So I know that many people who train service animals advocate and build relationships and networks so that they can take these animals into the environments in which they'll be performing to get them trained. And so it is kind of one of those you may have to advocate for yourself in that training situation. But just know that clarification is out there. All right, so types of dogs serving individuals with disabilities. You have hearing or signal dogs, mobility assistance dogs, social signal dogs, alert response dogs, and psychiatric service animals. And so these are all different animals that trained in a specific task or function, and then usually with an individual that's related to their disability. Let me just give you a quick example. So here at DNOM, we work with several veterans, and we had a veteran who came in with his service animal. And in our discussions with him, he explained that he had post-traumatic stress disorder. And what this dog was trained to do was to alert him if someone was coming from behind. Now that was a trigger for him. And so the dog would circle him to let him know someone was coming from behind. And so there are, again, individually trained to do a specific a task or function that's related to that individual's disability. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, there's no federal mandate under the ADA or any implementing regulations that requires a service animal be certified by any national service agency, and there is no mandate that a qualified service animal wear a certain type of designated vest. When you look to etiquette, and if you are someone who's using a service animal and trying to navigate access in our communities, I think people find it very helpful to have a vest or some type of identification, because otherwise people will not discern that it is working, and may come up to approach it and to pet it and do other things that are distracting to the job that it's been asked to do and trained to do. But again, there's no mandate anywhere that would require that to be the case. I did in my preparation read a case that I thought was kind of interesting, where a gentleman had gone to great measures to actually create a cape for his dog, and took it into Walmart and was asked if this was his service animal, and he said yes. And they asked, to, what is he here to perform? And he said, well, clearly the vest, the cape itself, should be clear as to the superpowers this dog can do. And it didn't go far, but I thought it was quite creative. But again, no vest is required. All right, so Title II and Title III of the ADA also allows for miniature horses. And this is entities must make reasonable modifications to allow the use of a miniature horse if they have been individually trained to work or perform tasks for an individual with a disability. So we are talking about dogs, and we are now talking about miniature horses having access to public entities, local state government entity program services and activities, as well as private businesses. Under Title II and Title III of the ADA, the exception is miniature horses. They have to be individually trained. Now, when we're talking about a miniature horse, we're talking about a range in height from 24 inches to 34 inches, not measured in hands. So you're not doing the hand measurement. From the shoulders, and generally weigh between 70 and 100 pounds. So we are truly talking about a miniature horse. I have a Great Dane who's 4 years old, and he weighs 240 pounds. So though he's a dog, he's even bigger than a miniature horse. So we're not talking about a large horse here. So what to consider when it comes to a miniature horse? Entities that are covered need to modify again if they're reasonable. And the regulations have set out a 4 assessment factors. So whether the miniature horse is housebroken, whether it's under the owner's control, whether the facility can accommodate the horse's size, type, and weight, and whether the horse's presence will not compromise the legitimate safety requirements for a safe operation of the facility. So given those 4 assessments, if they are reasonable, then the individual is allowed to have access and bring in their miniature horse. So why horses? A couple of reasons. So they have found, some studies have found that they are less allergic. People are less allergic to horses, less allergens that they carry, and they can be better for stability and pushing and pulling for individuals who are larger. And then the average service life of a dog is between 5 to 7 years, where a horse, it could be up to 27 years. And I know Kathy is on this session, and she may be able to help me with more accurate numbers, but the numbers that I came up with in terms of costs for service animals, when it comes to a dog, depending on the training, you can look at $15,000 to $20,000. And then I saw where with a horse, you could look up to potentially $60,000, again, for training. So knowing that a dog's service life could be shorter, people may look into perhaps a horse if, again, it can be individually trained to meet their service or function that they need help with. All right. Transportation provisions of Title II. So, as I said earlier, these are regulated by the U.S. Department of Transportation, the Federal Transit Administration, and the Federal Railroad Administration. And they define service animal as any guide, signal, or other animal. So this is a broader definition. It's not just a dog or a horse. It could be an other animal. And so again, these are provisions for public transportation. And so potentially someone could bring anything different than a dog or a horse and try to access public transportation. But again, it has to be individually trained to perform a certain task or function for an individual and is related to their disability. All right, so how do you know it's a service animal? So someone comes into a local, state, or government entity and or a private business and wants access. At the door, they are greeted by someone who can ask two questions. Is this animal required because of a disability? Or is it a service animal? Yes, it is. What task has the animal been trained to assist with? Now, you can ask these two questions if it isn't obvious that the need is there for the service animal. For instance, someone who is blind or visually impaired using an animal to navigate. So if it isn't obvious, you can ask them, is it required for a disability or is it a service animal? And what task or function has it been trained to perform? You're not permitted to ask anything that would elicit information about their disability, what the extent or nature of their disability is, medications, again, animal certification, there's no need for that. Courts have differed a little on this. It's been interesting to see. Some courts have said you don't need to show or demonstrate. Other courts have said you should be able to demonstrate what your animal can do. Currently, legally, they have no right to ask you that question or to have your animal in any way perform that function or task to demonstrate to you. And they can't say we are going to require that you use a service animal badge while you're in the facility. Nothing, they can't put anything on your animal that they would find to be useful for their benefit and not for yours or the animal's benefit. All right, so we know what they can ask and what they can't ask. We know what a service animal is in terms of access when it comes to Title I of the ADA. It's a broad definition for private employers. Title II of the ADA, Subtitle A, local government entities, state, local government entities. And Title III, private businesses, narrow, dog or horse. And then Title II, Subtitle B, transportation provisions, other animal. It's again broader. Regardless, the handler has certain rights and certain responsibilities. They must have access to all areas where members of the public and participants can go. Again, unless there's a safety reason. They always have to maintain control, and that includes they must have a harness or a leash or other tether, or be under a voice controller signal if they are unable, because of their disability, to use a harness or tether or leash, or that would somehow interfere with the animal's safety or the effective performance of the task or function they're going to be doing. And they have a right not to have surcharges or fees related to the service animal. Don't ask or require unless you do so for all. So someone brings in a service animal and suddenly now they have a fee, and where then in the past they've not surcharged anyone for a pet. You can certainly charge if there are damages that are caused, and the responsibility of the individual or handler, not the public accommodation or government entity, meaning that if you need to relieve your dog, you can't ask someone at a clerk's desk to do that. You have to be the person responsible for your animal at all times. So your rights are, as a handler, you can be asked certain questions. Is this related to your disability? Is this animal needed for a disability? Is it a service animal? What task or function is it trained to perform? And then you have certain responsibilities. You have to maintain control, and that can include a harness or a leash or a tether, or it may not include that if you're not able to do that. So navigating access. Again, there are safety concerns. If it's too clinical of an, or too sterile of an environment, an animal may not have access to a hospital, certain areas of a hospital. And again, if it's a publicly funded hospital, we're talking about Title II. If it's a private hospital, we're talking about Title III. But we're only talking about a dog or a horse. A restaurant, again, a dog or a horse, usually they're allowed. There may be capacity issues or capacity considerations when it comes to perhaps a miniature horse. Hotels, same thing, have to provide reasonable modifications to allow a dog or a horse. Retail establishments, rideshare companies, there have been several complaints by individuals being turned away from rideshare services like Uber and Lyft when they have a service animal. They were actually sued, and they settled back in 2017, putting a policy in place that they cannot discriminate against someone who's using a service animal and using rideshare services. But we have started to see that those trends continue to happen where people are denied access to that service. And then evacuation centers, certainly in this time of wildfires and hurricanes, service animals in evacuation shelters. Certainly, again, we're talking about Title II, so we're talking about a dog or a miniature horse, and we're talking about access to a government-funded shelter as it relates to allowing your service animal. Other considerations. Now, in Michigan, where we're from, we have a state-sponsored voluntary identification card and patch program. So someone can just voluntarily sign up with our Department of Civil Rights and get a statewide patch and certificate identification card. Now, again, these aren't required, but when you think about access, you think about wanting to be proactive, right? If there's a certain event or place you need to go to, it may be that you want to advocate proactively and make sure it's a smooth experience. And this may be one way that you can do that by having this information available. Hey, I went through this identification with the state. I've got this information. It might be helpful in terms of advocating for your access. In Michigan, we have certain licensing fee exemptions when it comes to service animals, and we also have criminal penalties as relates to treatment of certain service animals. To assault or injure or interfere with an individual and their use of their service animal can come with a fine and a misdemeanor. There can be vehicle owner liability to an individual or pedestrian who is blind using a crosswalk regardless of whether the service animal or cane were present. There are hotlines for false representation of service animals. And then we in Michigan, we have a service, you have to accommodate in our public accommodations, you have to provide reasonable access. And if you don't, again, there can be a misdemeanor and a fine attached to that. So that's just a sample of what some states may provide. Now, one of the other things that statewide many states are doing is this hotline for false representation. So lots of media hype around service animals when the likes of peacocks and turkeys are boarded onto planes, and so you see a lot of traffic in the media on the idea of people using animals and claiming that they're service animals, but in fact they're not. So again, many states are starting to put into place certain provisions that allow for not only penalties, but also people who can complain about someone who perhaps is falsely representing someone to be using a service animal. And again, there's also can be some local government entities that ban certain breeds, pit bulls, Rottweilers, animals with the increased risk of aggression. And so you may need to be mindful of that in your location specifically. Quarantine allows pre-screened guide and service animals to avoid quarantine, so as long as they're chipped when you're traveling. And then etiquette, I'm not really going to go into too much of the etiquette. I think it's just pretty self-explanatory, that you really want to look at someone who's using a service animal, that animal is working and therefore shouldn't be disrupted or interrupted in any of their time with their handler and the tasks or functions that they're being asked to perform. Are there any questions? I put a couple of different links for some other resources that are available, and happy to stick around and answer any questions. I know I kind of blew through that material. It's interesting to do this online, and I'm usually having people in the audience ask certain questions. So fire away. I'm happy to answer anything.
Amy, there's some questions in the chat. You might want to
Okay.
check the chat.
All right, let's see if I can get to the chat.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. When you're done with the chat questions, I just have two questions.
Yeah, go with your question first because I can't seem to figure out how to get back to my chat. So what's your question?
Are you sure?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead real quick with your question, and then I did find the chat. So go
Okay.
ahead.
No, you can go ahead. It's fine.
All right. So handouts. I think that this session, the first question is, will you provide us with handouts or a certificate? Susan, I'm gonna leave that question up to you. I know this session's been recorded. I'm happy to share this PowerPoint presentation with anybody. My contact information is at the on the last slide. It's amaes@dnom.org, and I can shoot that out to you at any time. Why hasn't the government taken control of certification and licensing? Business owners are so open for lawsuits because there are no controls. Right. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer to that. I can say one of the things that I neglected to say, mention that I promised I would mention, is that there's other federal laws that also affect service animals, and so what makes it an even grayer area for a while was that federal airlines. You get on an airplane and you travel someplace. Once you get on that airline, you are now covered by the Air Carriers Act, and that has its own set of regulations. And they've just back in January put out proposed regulations that actually narrow it to a dog and his miniature horse, similar to the Department of Justice, because what you were finding is they were having all sorts of animals that they were claiming that were service animals. But not only that, but it was also complicating because you went into the lobby of the airport, it's a private business under Title III, but then when you get on the plane, it's Air Carriers Act, differing definitions when it comes to access for a service animal. So I guess my answer in saying all that in a roundabout way is that until there's really consistency at the federal level when it comes to defining a service animal across the board in every aspect of daily living and someone's trying to access, we're not going to get that overall certification and licensing. So
And then
all those
wherever
federal
you're
agencies
traveling
need to play together.
wherever you end up has entirely different regulations too.
Exactly. Are there any regulations on the expenses of training service animals? Not that I'm aware of. Again, I just went online and did some research in terms of, what are some costs related to training animals. But, each state, I'm sure, has certain businesses. Like we have in Rochester, Michigan, we have a place that specifically trains service animals, and I'm sure they have a certain pricing structure that might be different than someone who's also doing something in California or Minnesota. So I can type my email address. I'm going to do that now at dnom.org. Again, happy to answer any questions. Happy to provide my PowerPoint presentation. And
I can send that in with next week's calendar.
okay. Any other questions? I think I got through the chat questions.
And Jess, you had a question?
Yes. So I have both an emotional, like anxiety disorder, and I have a physical disability. But I think if I got one for a physical disability, they wouldn't need to be trained in both, because just the idea of having a dog, whether it's certified or not, makes my anxiety go down. So, but I know that's not always the case for everyone. So when you're deciding a service dog, do you have to pick one or the other? And then I also had one other question about, I know that a lot of times when you get a service dog, they're already named. Are you allowed to name them yourself? Or in that case, would you have to buy the dog yourself and then name it and then make it a service dog?
Those are all really good questions. So really quickly,
If you want me to repeat something, I can.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can.
Okay. So Kathy, I don't want to pick on you real quick, but can you talk about your experience in getting a service animal and whether it comes named or not?
Yes, for leader dogs that were mentioned, the Rochester program, they prefer very strongly that you keep the name of the dog, because they've already done some training with it. And by the time you get it, it's used to its own name. And it's a lot to ask the dog to regroup. So I would say in general, that probably is
the case.
a standard.
Oh, darn. I wanted to be able to name my own dog. That's part of the fun.
It is. It's challenging. I've had some interesting dogs with interesting names.
Thank
But you get used to it.
Yeah. Thank you, Kathy. And as to your question, normally it's usually one animal that you are going to be presenting with in terms of having access. So if there are animals, dogs that have been trained to alert somebody to a panic attack. So if you have a level of severity, as I understand it, with anxiety, it may be that there's an animal, a dog or a horse that could be trained to alert you to that. And then in that case, that may be a task or function, right, related to a disability that you have.
Yeah.
So it certainly isn't, I guess the way to respond to this question is to say it's not, just don't write it off, right? If you can say and articulate, my animal has been trained to alert me to panic attacks, and in fact, you have trained that animal to do so, that can elevate it to that level of being a service animal.
Okay, but do you have to pick one or the other? Because, like, let's say you need help with opening doors. You have to pick opening doors, or I guess that's what I didn't understand.
Yeah, well, and so that's the problem, right? Because the guidance has certainly said that it's usually limited to one animal. Now, I'm really hesitant to say
animal.
Usually or generally, because there's always exceptions to that situation.
That's
So you
different.
may be that exception. There may be an exception where you say, I have this dog, and this dog assists me with my physical disability, and I have this dog, and this dog assists me with my panic attacks.
No, what I was trying to say was that, like, can it do both?
If you can train it to do both, yes.
Okay. Sorry about that.
No, I'm sorry. I was misunderstanding your question. But yes, I don't think that there's any, again, there's no set requirement for training, certification for training. So if you're able to train a dog to perform several tasks or functions, that's certainly allowable.
Okay.
Amy, I have a question.
Hmm.
This is Kathy, and this is the first time I've actually heard the description under employment and reasonable accommodation. That's really fascinating. So my question is, if there wasn't a specific task on my job, although there usually were, would needing a service animal to get to work be included as a reasonable accommodation?
I think it's arguable. All the cases that I looked at, Kathy, really were the situation where somebody was on the floor working and said that they needed their animal to be with them. And the courts lean towards this idea of saying, unless that dog's been trained in this specific environment or that animal's been trained in this specific environment to help you with an essential function. And arguably, I would say getting to and from work, well, now that I say that out loud.
Yeah, I know.
I
I wouldn't have had an issue because I
Right.
needed the dog to guide in a hospital setting, which is pretty,
Yep.
I'm sure we could have made that case, but it's
Yeah.
in question.
Yeah, it's a great question because an employer really, you got to get to work. That's up to you. And once you're there, then they have to provide some reasonable accommodations.
Okay.
But
And
it's a great question.
it's interesting that you say they don't need a vest because I've been working at Walgreens for 15 years. I'm not working there now because of COVID, but all of that coming from corporate Walgreens, they say all animals, all service animals are welcome. However, they need that vest to show that you are having a service dog. So I've had to tell people in the nicest way that they can't have their dog with them unless number one they're holding it, or number two, it can be any dog as long as it's small enough to hold. So that's fine. Or if it's an official service dog, they need to have some kind of vest. So let's say, I don't know, you're taking a bike ride with your dog and your dog is small enough to fit in the basket or something, and you take it out because you don't want it to be sitting out there in the blazing hot sun. So you bring it in, that's fine, like a family dog. If it's old, if it's small enough to hold, they don't give you an issue. But if it's like a Labrador or something, they have to see the vest. And I didn't think it was fair, but I'm just following company protocol. I don't want to lose my job, but I also, do you think they just made that up? Or because now that I'm hearing that, I'm like, maybe that corporate Walgreens was wrong with the ADA. I don't know.
Well, I think that corporate Walgreens has probably failed in a couple ways when it comes to the ADA. But right, I would challenge how they would enforce that. What vest are you looking at? You know what I mean? There's no nationally recognized vest or certification that the person needs to have. And so how are they going to enforce that?
Oh, okay.
There's another question or two in the chat.
Has the pandemic changed the rights of service animals? For instance, can dogs be excluded from entering a hospital? There are, I know that there are some CDC guidelines when it comes to service animals. I would say during this pandemic, again, it's going to look to see whether it's reasonable. And my experience, I recently became a foster care mom, and I've had to go to a lot of hospital appointments, and they allow one parent in. That's it, and the child. And so I'm certain that if that one parent needed to have their service animal because it performed a task or function related to their disability, that they'd have to allow that animal in. And I've not seen anything in the CDC guidelines that would suggest that because it's a dog that it can't enter any public facilities.
And then you think you may have put your email in the chat, but no one can see it.
Oh, I thought I did it to everyone. All right, hang on.
While you're doing that, we're going to say goodbye to Matthew, who's been our interpreter. Thank you very much for being here. And those of you if you want to stick around and ask some questions or chat to each other, that is fine. And Amy, thank you for being here. And if you need to take off, okay. If you want to hang out a little longer, that's great.
Yeah, so if
Whatever
there's no
works for you.
any other questions, I'm going to scoot on out of here. But happy to stick around if anybody's got anything else. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So those of you that are still on, I'll let you know some of the stuff that's coming up